Throughout these little points in this video series, I've been talking sometimes about the difference between the underlying principle of justice and how it actually exists today in at least the U.S. justice system, which often is an injustice system. One of the biggest differences is that in a moral, rational society, if somebody is, let's say, again, our example of you're accused of stealing his car. He wakes up and says, hey, my car is missing. Let's say the person actually did it. And let's say it's all the way proven. Okay, you stole his car. That's really bad. We don't like car thieves. We're going to have to figure out what to do about it. And people can, bicker and argue about that. But the first priority in the mind of just rational, moral people trying to see justice done is step one is make sure the victim is okay. Like step one is give him his car back. That's the starting point. Nothing else happens till you give him his car back. And make sure it's still in one piece. You didn't damage it and whatever. But that's not really enough. The punishment can't just be, oh, you didn't get away with stealing it. You have to give it back. Because then where's the deterrent in that? So making the victim whole, in other words, bringing them back to the state they were before the crime happened, often involves a deterrent of if you steal something from somebody else, it's something like you have to pay him back 3 times the amount you stole. If you stole $50 from somebody, we're going to make you give him 150 to not only give him back what he already had, but to make up for what he had to go through and to create a deterrent to people doing this in the future. Because if you're a thief and the worst that can happen to you is you get caught and you have to give it back and you can go try again, you're going to keep trying again. But if there's something worse, like you have to give it back and then, twice as much again, or you have to give it back and then we put you in a cage, or you have to give it back and we beat the tar out of you. And I'm not suggesting any of these. I'm just saying the idea of creating a deterrent so they don't do it again is a second piece. The first piece is to make the victim whole, if it's possible. Like if you cut off somebody's leg, well, you can't fix that. Well, I guess they can sew it back on if you're lucky. If you murder somebody, you can't undo the crime. There's nothing that can be done. And then it's a matter of trying to create a deterrent and doing as much as you can to, like it may be, well, we're going to take everything you have and sell it and give it to the family of your victim or something like that. Again, I'm not even saying what I think should happen. I'm just describing the mentality of repairing the victim situation as much as possible, which sometimes isn't possible, and then creating a deterrent to people doing it in the first place. Well, the thing is, in the U.S. Justice system, that isn't the priority at all. They don't care about repairing the victim. They will fine, if it's a crime you can be fined for, they fine you and the court and or government keeps the money. Even though you're not the one who got robbed, you didn't get victimized. Why is it that you get to keep the money that you're taking from the perpetrator instead of the victim? You didn't get harmed by it, but that's what the government does. And then in a lot of cases, the crime doesn't even have a victim. Government just makes up new crimes that don't have a victim. Like you're not allowed to have that certain thing, even though it isn't hurting anybody and you didn't steal it. You didn't harm or assault or threaten anybody, but we decided you're not allowed to have that. And if you have that, we're going to throw you in prison or we're going to fine you and make you give us a whole bunch of money. But even in criminal cases, a lot of time, a whole bunch of money goes to the government. Well, you don't have to make the government whole. They weren't the victim. But the focus isn't on doing whatever possible in form of restitution or whatever else to the victim. They do some of that, but the government also just cashes in on it. It's like if somebody comes along and, not government or cops, but just somebody comes along, hey, you stole his car. First of all, give his car back and then give me $1,000. It's like, wait, why you? Like, it sort of makes sense to make you give the victim some money to make up for what he had to go through, but not just some random person who demands money. You weren't the one harmed. You weren't the one robbed. But that's basically government's approach to it is how can we enrich government by way of enforcing crimes against people who weren't the government. Other people got victimized and the government gets richer as a result of it. So the incentive of a rational moral society is the first concern is the victim, to make them, and let's say the guy steals the car and smashes it up and destroys it or drives it off a cliff. Well, now you owe him a new car. Oh, but I don't have it. Well, then we're going to start selling your stuff or whatever, or make you work it off or whatever until you can buy him a new car and pay double or, whatever people decide to do. But the focus is the innocent person who got harmed, not enriching some politicians and some judges and some cops. And now you get the incentives are just ridiculous, where the cops can do asset forfeiture, where they just do highway robbery, literally highway robbery. They pull somebody over, they have a bunch of cash. They say, we're going to confiscate this because we think maybe it was drug related. We don't have to prove it. We don't have to convict you. We don't have to arrest you. We don't even have to charge you with anything. We're just going to say this and steal your money. And we just got a bunch of money. And you have to go through a process to try to prove that it wasn't, which is anti-justice in every way, as much as it could possibly be. Like, we're forcing you to testify against yourself. There's no presumption of innocence. There's no burden of proof. Like, we didn't have to prove anything. You have to prove you're innocent. There's no presumption of innocence. We start by assuming you're guilty and stealing your stuff, and then you have to try to get it back. And that happens a lot. Asset forfeiture steals just billions of dollars worth of stuff in the U.S., more than private crooks do combined, as a matter of fact. And so the idea that that has anything to do with justice is just ridiculous. So you can see the difference between how government uses the concept of justice to enrich itself, as opposed to how moral, rational human beings would use these principles to protect the innocent, both the wrongly accused and the victims of a crime. But you can see how much they just mangle these principles those in government mangle them to enrich and empower themselves. And it's kind of sad to watch. So I was just talking about the difference in mentality between the main focus being on the victim and repairing their situation, the victim of an actual crime, and the government version, which is government trying to enrich and empower itself whenever crime happens. They'll fine you and you have to pay it to the court instead of to the victim of your crime. Because government likes to use private crime, people victimizing each other, to enrich itself and empower itself. And unfortunately, that makes the entire justice system often turn into a complete joke. And I'll describe why. So you see TV shows of court dramas and crime shows and all that. And there's the judge, and the judge works for government, and the government pays him. He gets paid by government. Where does government get the money? It taxes everyone else. So everyone is forced to pay for the judges, just like they're forced to pay for the cops, and forced to pay for the courtrooms and all the employees and all that stuff. So the idea of it being objective when the disagreement is between you and government becomes ridiculous. It's one thing is if it's a guy and his neighbor arguing about whether he stole the car. Theoretically, government could be neutral and try to get to the bottom of what happened and try to make justice happen. That's often not how it turns out, but at least theoretically that could be that could make sense. But when the government is the prosecution and they're the one saying, we've charged you with this crime against the state, because when there isn't a victim, they pretend that your crime was against the state. Like if it's somewhere where marijuana is illegal, it'll be the state versus you, and your crime is against the state of, whatever state you live in. Well, who was the victim? How are they victimized? If you smoke a joint in your basement, who is victimized? Well, nobody, but they pretend that they're the victim. And if they can prosecute you and fine you, they get a bunch of money. Well, that's an incentive for them to create crimes that don't have victims because they get money and power out of it. Whereas if their focus is actually if somebody victimizes somebody else, trying to undo that and get restitution to the victim, you can only get so much money and power out of that if you're government. So they make up new crimes that don't have victims. And by the way, that's most crimes. most people who are convicted, especially at the federal level, are convicted of crimes that don't have a victim. And in principle, there's no such thing. There can't be such thing as a crime that doesn't have a victim. Like, you didn't hurt anybody, you didn't threaten them, you didn't take their stuff. How is it a crime? Well, it's a crime because government declared it to be a crime so that they could control something and then fine people and imprison them for not obeying. That has nothing to do with justice. That's the exact opposite of justice. That's government being the thief and calling it law, and even calling it justice, which is quite a slap in the face. But the fact that the judges work for government, it's not like government accuses you of something and then you're there saying, oh, I didn't do it. And then some neutral third party comes in to decide. No, the government courts and the government judges are going to decide. Now, there is still the clause that requires a jury trial if you demand one, where you say, I don't want a government paid judge deciding whether I'm guilty. I want normal people to decide. And to some extent, that works as a deterrent, kind of, even though there are a lot of ways to manipulate juries or make the jury not even happen or force someone into a plea bargain and things like that. But the idea of government providing the judges is like, okay, we're going to have this big football game. It's a really important game. By the way, the referees are employees of the other team, and they make up the rules as they go along. They call it case law, and they decide who's right and who's wrong, and what they rule, that's the end of it. That's the law, whatever they declare. Well, is that going to be a fair game when they're not even hiding that fact? It's bad enough if they like bribe the referee behind the scenes, but our justice system, they don't even do it behind the scenes. It's no mystery and it's no secret that the judges work for and are appointed by and paid by government. So obviously they have a huge conflict of interests if the dispute is between government and somebody else. There are some judges who are elected, but it's still, the parties decide who that's going to be. And that's not most judges. Like federal judges are all appointed by politicians as if they're going to be neutral go-betweens between politicians and their enforcers and the people. Like, they're on your team. You can't have the referee on your team and pretend it's a fair game. But beyond that, they go one step worse. Now, the concept of lawyers, it's sort of a running joke. Everybody hates lawyers. And there's lots of reason for the stereotype and the resentment and hatred. It is possible to be a decent human being and be a lawyer. Just barely. May be difficult in some cases. As the saying goes, no, it's the 99.9% of lawyers who are evil who give the rest a bad name. Maybe a slight exaggeration. But there is, again, if you look at principles versus practice, there is sort of a reason to have something kind of like a lawyer, as in somebody who knows and understands the principles that we've been talking about in this video series and doesn't have to start from scratch. Because somebody who doesn't know anything about all these principles may, accuse somebody of something and just say, well, I'm pretty sure they did it, punish them. And if you don't actually know these things and haven't thought them through, and you try to have a trial, you'll call somebody in who is going to try to give testimony, and yeah, but you weren't there. You're just saying what you heard somebody else say, and that's not reliable, and you can't do that. And it turns into a mess. So it is useful and good to have people who actually understand these concepts well enough to implement them and go through a process. And it might look like a trial. Go through a process of, all right, let's calm down. Don't be emotional and jump to conclusions. Let's go through the evidence in a way that makes sense. And it's like the goal is to find the truth, because we want to protect the innocent victims, but we also want to not harm people who were wrongfully suspected or wrongly accused of a crime. So somebody who understands these principles and knows how to debate back and forth and clarify what evidence should and shouldn't be considered relevant is a useful concept. Not everybody can do that. Not everybody's thought of these principles. I'm guessing that most of the people watching these video, there's at least a few of these things that are like, oh, that's what that's for. I never got that before. Because I was like that for most of my life. And so I wouldn't have made a very good lawyer or even a a non-government version of the same thing until you learn, oh, that's why they do these things. That's why you can't force them to testify against themselves. That's why you have to let the other person question the witness after the witness has said his stuff that, that sounds bad. You have to let the other guy ask him questions about it. It's called cross-examination. And if you don't know these things, you're way more likely to end up having a trial or a hearing or whatever that turns out not being fair and not providing justice, just because you haven't backed up and thought about the basics of, well, what do we and don't we allow, and what's the best way to determine the truth? So the concept of people specializing in this stuff actually makes sense. The concept we have now, the government version, doesn't, because the government version is you are licensed by the bar to practice before this court, which means you need government's permission just to go into their court and play their game and argue in front of one of their judges. Well, that's a little weird, because remember the analogy of the football team and saying, if there's two teams and you just found out, the referee is paid for and employed by the other team, don't worry, he'll be objective and fair, but he happens to work for them. You'd be like, hey, wait a minute. This is one step worse. This is the equivalent of saying, okay, not only is the referee paid for and employed by the other team, but to be on this team playing against them, you need to ask the judge for permission, the judge who works for them. You need to ask his permission to be on the team playing against them. You need his approval. And he can take that approval away whenever he wants. So if you're a really good quarterback and he decides, you're doing too well, I'm going to find some reason to say you can't play anymore because you're doing too well. That's the equivalent of having the government license lawyers. And technically it's the bar exam and stuff like that. But in the end, the court decides whether to let somebody be a lawyer, which means immediately if there's a conflict between government and a normal person, and there's some huge thing at stake, there's like government corruption or some fundamental principle, the lawyer trying to argue in favor of the little guy has to keep in mind, like, if I do this too well or annoy the court too much by bringing up things that they don't want me to bring up or something like that, they're the ones who give me this license and they're the ones who can take it away and end my career if I actually stand up against government-approved injustice. And so when you have the lawyers who answer to the ruling class, of course it's not going to be a fair playing field. And even more directly, there's the concept of, I'm sure you've heard this on TV shows, you have a right to an attorney. If you can afford one will be provided to you, blah, 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 blah. And as expensive as they are, a lot of people can't afford them. Then you'll be provided with what's called a public defender. Well, that's a lawyer who's not only licensed by the government, he's paid by the government. He's paid by the people prosecuting you. And they pretend to keep it independent and they try to pretend, well, he'll do it. And usually what he does is try to talk his client into plea bargaining. That's what a lot of defense attorneys, even private ones, do. But the idea of you're allowed to have a representative, he just happens to work for the people prosecuting you, the government, is ridiculous. The idea that that's going to be an objective, fair outcome, where now it isn't just the referee works for the other team. It isn't just the referee and the other team decides who can work on your team. It's they get to decide who your team captain and quarterback is going to be. They'll appoint you a free quarterback. Do you think that's going to be a fair, equal outcome? No, obviously not. So the idea of having actual like arbiters and judges who are actually objective and neutral is really important and absolutely doesn't exist under government. And there are actually a lot of disputes that are already handled by private, what's called arbitration, where somebody who doesn't work for government, but let's say two people are arguing over, I don't know, where their property line is or something. Because I want to build a garden here. And he's saying, yeah, but the line's over there. You're building it on my side of the line. No, it isn't. It's over here. And, that's one example of a zillion disputes that could happen. And often people will go to private arbiters to do private arbitration, which means we're both going to go to this company, and this company doesn't know either one of us. We're both going to pay to have the case heard, but they don't make money or power off of one of us winning and the other one losing. Like, it makes no difference to them. And they have a reputation for being fair and trustworthy, so that both of us agree to go to them. Because it's like, yeah, they seem to be fair and they seem to do a good job of looking into things and finding out what's true. So instead of us having a dispute for each other and, being enemies and yelling at each other for the rest of our lives, let's agree to go to this arbitration company or this arbiter. We both give them the facts. They look into it. We both pay them. And it's their job to look into it and make a decision of what they think is fair. And we're going to agree ahead of time. What they come up with, we're going to abide by that and to finally settle this dispute and be done with it. And there's a lot of ways in which that happens. In fact, a lot of companies will make you sign a thing that say, if there's a dispute between you and us, first we'll go to private arbitration and see if they can work it out. Because A, it's less expensive than government courts, and B, it gives justice way more often because the person there isn't a referee who works for one of the teams. He's an actual neutral referee who's just trying to figure out what's fair. And because his business depends upon people considering him fair and careful in his judgments, he has to keep being fair and careful in his judgments. If somebody who does arbitration gets caught taking a bribe, that's the end of his career and his business forever. Like, the moment anybody knows, wait, you can be bribed? Well, I'm not going to agree to go to you. And nobody goes to you unless both sides agree to it. Well, when it comes to government, they don't ask for your agreement. They make you go into their courts. They literally will drag you into their courts if they have to. And then you get to play the completely lopsided game where they own the referee, they own the other team, they get to decide who can be on your team, and sometimes they'll appoint a quarterback for you if you can't afford one yourself. How do you think that's going to go? But the concept of neutral third-party arbitration makes tons of sense. If there's a dispute, we need to bring in somebody who we both consider fair and neutral and objective and rational, and we'll both plead our cases to him and we'll both rely on whatever he decides. And normal people can do this outside of like formal court settings, and often arbitration isn't even a formal thing. But I mean, just three normal people can do it. It's like they have a dispute and they both go to their, they both happen to have the same friend. And they're like, hey, can you help us settle this? I'm saying my property's line is here and he thinks it's over here. And you're like, okay, wait. Okay, first of all, I don't want to make enemies here, but like, I'll help if I can. I'll look into it. Will you guys like shut up when I'm done? Like, if I look into it and I figure out, the best as I can, do you both trust me to try to make justice happen? And if they both go, yeah, we know you're not going to try to rip off either one of us. So you look into it and you decide and let us know, and we'll deal with it. Whatever. We'll put up with whatever you decide it is. So, this third person looks into it and like finds the property deeds and measures it or whatever and goes, yeah, it turns out the line is right here. It's like halfway through where you wanted the garden. And so if you put it here and okay, fine. Now we're done the dispute because somebody neutral and fair that we both trusted decided to help out. That's a very valuable, very useful concept, the concept of arbitration. And it's still in practice, and it still gives justice more affordably and more fairly than government does. But a lot of cases, the government doesn't give you a choice. You're going to use our courts, and we're going to have this ridiculously lopsided, slanted game in which everything is biased against you in every way imaginable. And then you're going to get stomped on, and we're going to pretend it's justice. So once again, the government version often has very little in common with the actual concepts underlying what justice should be. Okay, so we've run through a number of points here, and I hope that's given some people a better grasp on where these various legalese things came from and what the underlying principles actually were, many of which are a very good idea and will still be a good idea even when it isn't government courts and enforcers playing the game and basically hijacking the concepts of actual justice and using them as a source of power for themselves. But you can see that. You can see that in the history of the US. You can see it in the history of England. You can see it in a lot of the world, how the legal system started, or at least evolved from, concepts that actually made sense. They were actually about freedom and justice and protecting the innocent, both the innocent victims of a crime and the innocent people wrongfully accused of something. And how over time that was hijacked to be used by ruling classes as more power for themselves. And the most obvious example of that is that you can see a society in which some people, an actually free society, but in which some people, it's their job to protect you. Let's say you know a neighbor. Everyone knows this guy. He's a good guy. He's armed. He's good at combat. He's a big dude, but he's fair. And everybody knows his number in the neighborhood. And if something horrible goes wrong, or they hear someone breaking into their house late at night, they all know to call him. And maybe they all pay him a few bucks a month so he can be on call and ready to come at a moment's notice if something goes wrong. And none of them view him as their rightful ruler or as a legislator or a lawmaker. He's just a guy. But for the sake of justice, they want somebody to be able to come along. And maybe in addition to him, they know people who act as private investigators. Okay, my lawnmower is missing. Is there anything I can do to figure out who took it? And I think maybe it's Fred. And no, he says it's Bob. And, back and forth. People who specialize in investigating things and whether it's, dusting for fingerprints and that sort of thing, or looking into records and looking up stuff. In a free society, there would totally still be a place for those people, and dispute resolution, and arbitration, where two people have a dispute and they agree to go to a third party and let him, choose somebody that they both think is going to be fair and nice and decent about it, and let him try to come up with a solution that they'll both go for, and things like that. And instead, in the name of justice, government has hijacked the process and made it mostly a tool for injustice, where they use it to dominate and control people. And the concept of crime, which once upon a time meant somebody hurt somebody else, we have to make a deterrent, stop them from doing that, and try to, give restitution to the victim or somehow undo the crime as much as is possible. That has turned into a protection racket, exactly like the mafia. You will give us money to do business in this city, and we will protect you. But mostly we will protect you from ourselves breaking your kneecaps if you don't give us the protection money. That's all government is. And to pretend that that's about justice or protection or freedom at this point is just ridiculous. No, it's about power and control for them, done under the guise of a justice system, which most of the time doesn't give any justice. But I still think it's good for people to know where a lot of those concepts came from, what due process actually means, why there should be presumption of innocence, that you're presumed innocent until proven guilty, why there should be an equivalent of rules of evidence. We don't just blindly take people's word for it. We don't believe whims and claims. We want to know what actual evidence can actually prove whether or not something happened. We understand why there should be a burden of proof. Hey, if you accuse that guy of doing something bad, you have to demonstrate some reason to think he did. You can't just make it up and expect people to go, beat him up because you said you think he did it. There's a burden of proof. Or if you think he broke your car or he did this or whatever, you need to demonstrate some evidence that actually shows the rest of us that that's true. Even the concepts of indictments and warrants. If you're going to tackle somebody, I'm pretty sure you just beat up my neighbor or stole his car or something and I'm going to tackle you. There has to be a threshold before you'll even do that, before you'll even try to do a trial to see if you can actually prove that they did it. There can't just be a hunch or a wild guess. If we want actual justice to happen, we have to behave as moral people who, yes, we get outraged at injustice, but no, we don't just act on our emotions. We have brains too. We use our rational minds to make sure we figure out what is true before we try to make justice happen. Because if you don't have truth, you don't have justice. And so that's why there are all the things like the right to remain silent and the right to cross-examine witnesses testifying against you, the right to confront accusers and their witnesses, the right to have somebody who knows these rules maybe do a better job of representing you. But what government does with those actual rights is makes it an excuse to rob everybody in the name of taxation, to build these huge courts and pay judges and lawyers and all that, and then say, this is justice. We're forcing you to pay for our version of protection and justice, but we're going to pretend it's about protecting you. No, it isn't, any more than if the mafia did that. Actual justice means protecting the innocent from aggressors. And government is always an aggressor. It robs people. It controls people. It steals from people in the name of taxation and legislation and law and regulation. The fact that occasionally it stops some other thief doesn't make it moral, any more than it's moral to have a mafia when, yes, in a lot of cases, a mafia taking over a city has caused lower level crime to go down because they don't want competition. So their thugs are out in the streets beating up pickpockets and stuff to make that crime go down while they're still robbing people themselves. That's not justice. And neither is the government version of justice. Nonetheless, it did evolve from and then hijack principles that are worth knowing and worth understanding. And I hope this video series has helped some people get a better grip on what some of those concepts are for, where they came from, and why they really are valuable, and how they've been hijacked and perverted by government to serve the interest of authoritarian power. But these are important things to know. When we have a free society, these principles are still going to matter, and people should still understand them, even when they're not having to do battle with a giant authoritarian monster that's calling its atrocities justice. There will still be a need for real justice, and there will be a need for the people to understand the best chance we have to make real justice happen. And that requires understanding a bunch of these principles that I just explained to you. So I hope this video has been useful to you, and that's the end.